You clipped on the word clipping.
Must be just that word.
I see your slides.
Okay, I think Russ was volunteering to drive the slides, so when he shows up, I will let him do that. Where is the link to the notepad for this session?
Are you looking for the button or the URL?
The URL.
I just had the URL in chat if it.
Is this working now? Man,
Yeah, I can hear you.
what a hater.
Let me check too. Can you hear me? I think so.
Thought that I had already declined to grant these permissions in some previous session and like was not letting me back that out. So I switched to another browser. Now it's working fine.
Yay. Wait for a moment more, see if Russ joins. You know, I will drive slides until he shows up. Thanks everyone for taking a chunk out of their day to join for an interim meeting of the STIR working group. Our session is, as usual, held under the Notewell. I believe everyone here is already familiar with the Notewell, but if you're not, please take a moment to go become familiar with it before you contribute to the session in any way. Our agenda today looks as follows. We're currently planning to start with talking about the identity header errors handling draft that Chris has been working on, followed by a discussion of RCD, and then the connected identity for STIR updates and the potential charter discussion that comes along with that. Does anybody have any adjustments to the agenda that they want to make? Hi, Russ. I see that you've joined. Are you fully connected?
If I am.
All right. I believe you volunteered earlier to drive slides.
I did. I'm loading them.
I will quit doing the slide share. You should just be able to click on the slide share button that's next to the hand button in the upper left-hand bar, and they'll all be there ready to go.
Oh, you already loaded them.
Yes.
And I believe we're still asking for a note taker, right? Or someone volunteered
Yep.
that I didn't hear about.
I'll happily take note.
Was that Jack?
Yes, it was.
Thank you very much. You have our undying gratitude.
And celebratory music.
Okay, so let's do the intro slides, and
I think
Yeah.
Robert.
I had already stepped through the note well, and I
Oh,
did not
awesome.
hear any. I did not hear any agenda bashes, but we still don't have. Well, we have a minute taker. Jack just volunteered for that. I really don't think we need a JavaScribes group this small. We can all watch the chat and see if anything needs to be relayed. Is there any other administrivia we need to attend to? If not, then I think that we can move on to the first, which is the error handling presentation. And Russ, at this point, I'm going to let you drive. I'm going to focus on helping with notes.
thank you much. And Chris, this is the slide deck you want, I believe, right?
Yes.
All right, then I'm going to turn off my video and let you go.
All right, thank you. Yeah, the slides haven't changed from the last time. So next slide. So actually at the last interim meeting, we had a really great discussion about this document. And I, in fact, listened fully again to the meeting again to make sure I captured everything. And really put a lot of changes into it, but I think all for the better. So point one, we moved away from the multi-part MIME approach, created text to define the use of multiple reason headers, something we need to talk a little bit about. And then also defined optional parameter PPT for reason to hold the passport value directly in the reason header itself. Next slide. We also talked about privacy implications of the passport, you know, going in the backward direction, that it might expose things to beyond the authentication service that sent it. So I integrated specific text to say that it's a must for the authentication service to remove the corresponding reason header for the passport it authored when sending the initial invite. Next slide. Then I talked a little bit about compact form in the document. Well, we had a discussion about compact form and putting that explicitly in there to potentially save some bits. And also people felt like that provided some level of privacy protection as well. So I think that's reasonable. So we put where you could just include the signature similar to compact form of a passport, and then use that as the key that the authentication service would look at. Next slide. Yeah, so this was the part that I think, you know, was the question I probably have back to the group, and maybe back, this is also potentially a question back to SIPCORE as well. RFC 3326 has this statement in it: a SIP message may contain more than one reason value, but all of them must have different protocol values. an implementation is free to ignore reason values that it doesn't understand. So in order to implement the way that we talked about it last time, we sort of have to ignore that rule. So the way that I created the document is to actually update RFC 3326 to say that you can have multiple reason header fields with the same protocol, which in this case would be SIP. I'm looking for feedback on that to see if that people think that would break any implementations or anything like that. And like I said, I will reach out to SIP Core as well after we have this discussion, or if we adopt it as, you know, as a document. So any thoughts on that anyone wants to provide, or I guess, you know, thoughts in general about any of the proposed changes that I made? John?
Looks good to me. I mean, just looking at this now, and I know we've talked about this before, you know, I mean, even if it does give people heartburn, I could imagine ways that we could, I mean, I don't know how strictly protocol values are defined, but if we did protocol values as, you know, stir, and then like with a dash for different PPT types even, right? Like as if to suggest that what the actual protocol is, this reason's being given for, is not just SIP, it's for stir. And I'd need to go back and look at, you know, if they have any language around what protocol values means there that would preclude that. But this could let you be like, well, you know, this reason is why I rejected, you know, this shaken passport. This is the reason why I rejected this RCD passport, right? If you could like split it up even by PPT types. That, right. Anybody think that's crazy?
I don't think it's crazy. I mean, I think we could come up with other schemes. Jack, can you respond to that?
Yeah, well, I don't think the fundamentally that's broken, but I don't think you could like break it down by PPT type, because theoretically, like you could have multiple passports of the same type, but you could just do like 1, 2, 3, 4. But that does feel a bit silly.
That's, yeah, I was sort of thinking that actually, but it is a little bit of a hack.
The stir might help. Like, you know, to just to be clear, it's not that we're rejecting some SIP level thing, but this is actually a stir level thing. And in some cases, having the specificity of which specific passport type you're rejecting, I could imagine semantically would be useful. I mean, you should be able to figure it out from the compact form, but like, you know, I could also imagine, you know, if, for example, we have these RCD third-party use cases where it's actually like an intermediary that inserted that one, and so you wouldn't recognize necessarily the compact form as it got back to you. You know, I could at least imagine it being semantically useful to communicate that, like, this, you know, it was a passport of this type that caused it. I mean, imagine if it's like a passport type that's like unsupported or something. Like, you know, those kinds of things could conceivably be useful. I don't know. It's just an idea that occurred to me for the first time looking at this slide.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good one, actually. And maybe it would be good to just use that. Russ?
So if you were to take John's suggestion, does it need to update RFC 3326?
How it defines protocol values. If protocol values are, you know, pretty strictly constrained in that, then it might, but I need to go look. I'll look at that real quick while we're sitting here.
Yeah, that would be my guess. If we're defining a new protocol, I think that would.
Yeah, because it's a different process to get to approved, right? That's why I raise it.
Yeah, right. It's one that we don't necessarily want to go through.
So I have a question. I have not done this, and it would, at this point, take me a little while to spin up the tooling to do this, but maybe there are other people on the call that are still actively involved in SIP stack work. Have you tried taking a message that would have multiple reason headers and run it through the stack and see if it cared? Has anybody taken one of these things and like shoved it through whatever the current good packet decoding graphical inspectors are and see if they are upset or not. Wireshark-like things. And it doesn't matter if they do or not, other than just having an early indication if there's going to be lifting that would have to be done afterwards, or if it would just sail through.
Right. Yeah, I have not, but it's a good idea to do. John, you want to comment on that?
About that, we would that's some empirical testing that needs to be done. But just looking at 3326, what it actually has is in IANA considerations like that allows you to register those protocol types. And so like, and it basically just says that it has to refer to either an IT recommendation or an RFC. And so I think we'd be perfectly within our rights to say we're registering based on RFC 8224 or 8225, you know, this, and for other PPT types, like whatever, you know, RFC to be is for RCD, you know, could have its own reference from that. So it looks like it's pretty pluggable if we want to put in things with finer granularity. Whether that would make anything barf, whatever it is a completely different empirical question.
Yeah, that sounds like a good path forward anyway. Roman?
We do see multiple reason headers, like especially with SIP disconnect reasons, more often than not. So even though it violates the spec, you would see, for instance, like a SIP error message and 2 or 3 different SIP reason headers in there.
Okay, so you already have seen it. You're saying you have already seen that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if something barfs at that, it probably be seeing that already. So it's not something which is, even though it's a violation for the RFC, it's not unusual.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Jack.
I guess I just want to clarify the fact that if we had like a fixed set of protocols, if we would go down that route, I still can't see how that would quite work because of the fact you can have like an arbitrary number of identities with the same passport type. Like nothing else blocks that. So if we had like a separate protocol registered for each passport type, you would still have the same problem if someone put 2 divs, for example.
I think what we're saying is that we would register stir that would essentially allow you to have multiple reason headers, even though that technically violates 3326, but at least it's a new protocol that, you know, nobody can say that, you know, like if there's already a SIP reason header and now you're sticking in a new one, at least it's in a separate protocol space than the other ones, I think is the logic.
Okay, that doesn't quite match what I thought we had said, but that sounds sensible.
Yeah. Robert, did you want to interject?
Well, if we're seeing multiple reason headers in the wild anyhow, a small document going through SIPcore that just relaxes the one restriction should be something that should sail through easily enough. Then we could still pursue having the separate identifiers, but we could just get the spec part of the multiple header field part out of the way.
Yeah. Ben?
So you may have just answered my question indirectly a minute ago when you talked about registering stir as the protocol. I was going to ask if we can do an IANA registration of the protocol, does that mean we don't have to update 3326? But maybe we still do because of the multiple reasons per protocol.
I think that's what we sort of temporarily concluded, you know, based on what Russ was saying, that we wouldn't have to update RFC 3326. We could define a new protocol and then sort of let the multiple thing go by. But, you know, I think Robert's suggestion is good too, if that's a quick thing to send through SIPcore. John, you want to go?
And I think, the reason why I was barking down the tree of let's register separate ones for separate things is that I thought it would make it more palatable if there were a multiplicity of them, right? And that it's likely that if there are multiple passports, they're going to have multiple passport types. To Jack's point, div is a perfect example of one that violates that. But like that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be cases where it would disambiguate it. But I think I'm relatively persuaded by Jack's point that, like, yeah, you just need to bite the bullet and say that there can be multiple reason headers of the same type present. I'm still not sure that completely obviates the utility of doing separate registrations for separate PowerPoint types, but like it's a registry. Like we can do that, and if people want to use it, they can use it. And if people think it's useless in implementation, all we're costing ourselves is a couple of lines in, on the IANA website. So.
Mm-hmm. So was the conclusion there that we should register stir and you can use multiple stir? I just want to make sure because I think we had a couple inputs. I just want to see where we settled.
Valuable to register stir separately from SIP. Just to be clear, it's not a SIP level failure, right? And like if we feel like sub-registrations are going to have a value for some use cases, we can do that. But I do think Jack's argument that you could, it can be 15 divs, right? It's really not clear. And how much insight is, our relying parties who are receiving this in backwards direction really going to have if there's like, divs that they didn't create, if they're looking at compact forms, those things got to be peeled off by these entities they go by. And like, I'm confident those entities can peel those things off if they go by. But I mean, for a case where it's really the originating AS that is generating, for example, a shaken passport and an RCD passport separately for whatever reason, like that's a case where getting those both back, I could imagine there being some value in being able to differentiate them as reasons. So like I would say let's for now just like do stir and say, that people who feel like registering more things in the IANA registry for other passport types or whatever can kind of build off of the base stir registration and have stir dash RPH or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah. Yeah, and we have time to talk about it as well and think more about it. Okay. I forget, do I have any more slides? Yeah. So I think that I assume everybody's okay with the other changes. Like I said, I think we had a great conversation about it. Hopefully that brings us closer to something that's more palatable for everyone.
So given the direction we just decided, which is new protocol identifier instead of a update to the other RFC, my feeling is one more rev than a call for adopt.
Okay. That works for me. Jack?
Just to clarify, I think it does still require an update to that RFC, because that does very explicitly state that you have to have one reason header per protocol. And even if we register stir, we'd still be doing multiple reason headers for the stir protocol. So I think you still need to update that.
Would we want to do that in this document or?
Right, I think Robert suggested a separate document.
I've almost finished writing the update text. I will paste it into the chat in a minute.
You've already got the internet draft written. I guess Robert's going to take that one on.
Well, that's good. We're efficient here.
From our problem to Roman's point. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and I need to, well, I could do it either way, but I'll send an update with that clarification, and then I'll also remove the update to 3325. I can do that quickly anyways.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I think the next document we're going to talk about is rich call data.
Right. Okay, next slide. So yeah, I got a number of comments from Russ and Jack and Ben. All very good comments. I think I sent back what I did for all those updates in the new document. So thank you to all those review comments. One change that we did make at the last minute here, just so everyone is aware, is added a new claim value for APN, alternate presentation number, something that has been been thought about for a while, and I think has come back to more relevance. So we thought, I mean, it's a fairly straightforward one, so hopefully everyone's okay with that one, but thought it was important enough to add. Next slide. Next slide.
Sorry, I thought I had unmuted. When I reviewed the diffs, I saw the addition of the APN, but I didn't see much text about when this would be used. Is this intended for like the doctor calling not from his office, or something else?
There's a number of use cases, and John, feel free to add to this as well. You know, there's toll-free use case. There's other scenarios where the presentation number is different from the calling number. John, you want to add to that?
Of people asking for this, man. Like, so I got worn down on this because like the party line I was trying to tell on this. So when we did RCD, we made this like one-off for NAM, right? That is like separate from what you do in a J card that can contain the display name that is shown in the from header field. And like, you know, the story for alternate presentation number that I was trying to tell anyway was, well, you do a very simple J card, you put a tell field in the J card, and you have the telephone number in it, and you're done. But I mean, I think I've been gradually worn down to the point that this is a common enough use case, enough people are clamoring for it, that this is worth having a one-off like NAM. And that's really what this is. This is just saying there's going to be one more thing that's like NAM. You know, I would rather do this than, you know, to describe one presentation, one proposal that I heard recently, then put the display number, the intended presentation number, in the display name field of the from, so that it would show up in NAM. When I saw that as something that was being floated, I was like, okay, let's just do another one-off that makes it clear this is what the alternate presentation number is, rather than people like overloading NAM for it because they don't feel like having to do a J card when all they want to do is put in a number. So that's what sold me on this. But Jack, explain to me why I'm wrong or right.
I wasn't actually. I was just going to ask why then is APN kind of it's J card or it's JCD, JCL, or but NAM can be included with a J card? Like, why are those different?
The must not for if you're using APN, you must not have a tell in the J card.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that was just to make it clear that if you're already doing a J card for some other reason, like you should just have to do APN. If you believe we should apply the same to NAM, I guess in principle I wouldn't object. Like that, if you're having a J card at all, let's not have any of the shortcuts. Like all that stuff should appear in the J card rather than being fields that you have to parse separately. Because yeah, like what if there's a conflict, or like, I mean, I just want to get into that. I hadn't thought about, that really the same argument I was making for APN applies to NAM. I would be okay if that's the restriction you're suggesting.
I'm not sure I have opinion. I was just confused by the difference.
I didn't want there to be conflicts, right?
With the name, what would the equivalent be in a JCard? We kind of been looking at it, and I mean, for an individual, it's the first and last name maybe, but for a company, it's the organization. You may not have a first and last name.
That's also a good point.
Concern with that is name kind of provides the ambiguous, if you can only display a limited set, here's what I want.
Mm-hmm. Russ?
First, if he's going to respond to the last speaker, to Jack.
I totally agree. I mean, I wonder if there couldn't be, I mean, is there any similar ambiguity even with tell? I was just trying to think if there is. I mean, I know you can have multiple tells and they can have URIs and stuff. They can be like fancy in a JCard. And so it might actually be ambiguous, like which one you intend to be the presentation number if you're doing it in tell. I mean, there probably are some ambiguities that surround all this, and I don't want to undersell that. But your point is taken, Alec, that like that does make this semantically different, because people use the display name in the from header field to contain a variety of information that could be personal names, could be organizational, and it, do we want to say if there's a noun present, you can't have organization in JCard, right? Like that, it would be a different set of prohibitions that we need to construct around that if we intended to prevent literally any conflict with that.
There's sorry, I was going to say there's the formatted text FN property, which seems to be the one that is sort of the equivalent of name, but we haven't defined that as, that way. But it seems like that's the one, at least in the examples, that is closest to what just the general one-line name value is.
Yeah, so I mean, like today, we'll put RCD information in a shaken passport, and it could contain a JCard with a first name, a last name, and an organization name. And when we verify a call, we'll take out the name claim and set that as the PAI header. If there was a first name, a last name, and an organization, what would we set? That may exceed character lengths, the combination. How would you merge them into one, display name? Because we're trying to make it work for a dumb handset. It could be a POTS line, right? It's just, setting the CNAM so that it's not much, but at least it's a little bit of RCD information that's sent to it. So the name provides a nice ambiguous. If all I can do is a, pretty plain text, I'm just going to use this. I think now that I think about it, that same thing could happen with the tell URI, right? Because you could have a work phone, a mobile phone, a home phone, right, in the JCard, and it would be unclear which one you were using for the alternate display or alternate presentation number. But if you have a specific field for APN, then like this is what you use. It's very clearly telling you.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and I think you saying that is sort of how I think we thought about it originally as well. It was sort of like the default, and we required it.
I was going to say.
So I think maybe that's sort of the differentiation. APN is a little bit of a special case. Also sort of a default thing if you're not going to use anything else, but I think there's more correlation to some of the fields in JCard if you want to use it in JCard as well. Russ, you want to go?
So is the passport signer expected to do anything to validate the APN? We expect them, like in the shaken model, we expect them to be authoritative about the calling number. What about this number?
I think we are expecting some level of validation to occur around that. And like, I don't know if we want to put specific policy of what people are supposed to do that. But, you know, Jack can probably speak to the UK case better than I can, to the distinction between the 5 types of presentation numbers and like the network number and so on, and the ways that those things are allocated in the UK. But like, yeah, and I mean, I think I am increasingly persuaded, because this is one of the issues that came up with TEL as well. Like, if you were going to use TEL for this, are we sure the semantics of TEL are actually, it's the presentation number, right? And you know, the reason that this comes up is, you know, precisely because there could be alternate versions of different numbers that are in TEL, and which one is actually intended to be the presentation number is the question. I tried to toe the line that, like, well, by having JCard be an RCD at all, the entire semantics is this is intended for presentation to the end user, right? And it's kind of up to the UI how it's going to parse those and sort those, but it's going to do so with the understanding of whatever it is that's in RCD, the intention is end users are going to see it. And like, but this conversation is convincing me, I think that may not be tractable, and that ultimately it might be worth having an APN even in those cases where there is a JCard with a TEL in it, precisely because it indicates this is the one that we intend to be present, you know, the presentation number, in which case we should remove the restriction that's in it now.
I understand what the, you know, when we're kind of looking at maybe more like legacy network, I mean, not ancient necessarily, but not things that support really rich call data. A potential, you know, use case would basically be the verification is like creating a PAI header with this APN number so that it shows up when it's sent to the handset, right? That's kind of the intent that we could use. So the name goes in the display name of the PAI, and the APN goes in the number of the PAI. So when it's sent to the handset, it could be a dumb handset that just does basic CNAM and basic number display, but now you get the information. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I think
yeah.
APN,
we say from or paid or what was the other one? Alternate something. Alternate number, I think.
Okay.
Thing. Yeah.
Jack?
Sorry, I got distracted by trying to type what's being said. Yeah, so I think the thing there is like name and presentation number are kind of different because there are standard ways of presenting those to the user already. And so like having a nice way of keeping them separate and unique and like easily, like, so you don't have to do some munging with the JCard to work out what on earth you want to display, would definitely go towards the fact that we should just remove the requirement that if you have an APN you can't have TEL in the JCard, to be more similar to NAM.
Yeah, I sort of buy that. Hala?
That it's going to be presented as the TN, as the calling TN, so that the called party doesn't really realize this is an alternate presentation number. It's just the number that if they wanted to call back, is that it? But we are calling it alternate presentation number because we know it's not the real number they're calling from. Correct? Or am I missing something?
Correct. It's that we know it's not the network number, right? And so yeah, because of that, it will it should be the thing that shows up to the user. But for cases where there is a separate network number, you know, operators can still leverage that for their own sinister purposes. That's the idea, yeah.
So at what point is it at the originating end that we are submitting all of the certificates, delegate certificates, etc., just proofs of authorization that this party is still entitled to use the alternate presentation number? It's at that point, just like all of the good passport stuff that we have created so far?
Yeah.
I think the interaction with JWT constraints is identical. So if it's a delegate cert or something, you could still have constraints around it.
Okay.
But it
Thanks.
it is part of the RCD, so I think the intent is that, you know, this is sort of extra information.
Okay, so there's no extra verification being done just because it's an alternate.
Well, no, RCD information, it should be, there should be more scrutiny of RCD, or, well, I don't know, maybe equivalent scrutiny. So I think it should be validated just like any of the other RCD information.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, good discussion. I think I included we sort of already talked about this, I guess, but I included the example. So, Subir?
Yes, thank you. So I have a question on who determines that to put this APN.
It probably depends on this. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Whoever is creating the block of JSON that you see in front of you now and choosing to assign it, right? And so, I mean, in a shaken-like regime, it's the, you know, OSP or whatever that is generating this and sticking it in the password. And so, I mean, it's, if OSPs are going to vouch for alternate presentation numbers that they shouldn't, of course, that can be an issue, right? In the same way, if they vouch for origes that they shouldn't, that can be an issue. I'm just not sure I saw a material distinction in the permissions model around that.
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly about callback number, I believe. So it's probably a decision made at the enterprise level, but whoever vets that or authorizes it through a certificate or whatever the mechanism is, I think that's dependent on the use case.
I see. Okay. So is there any use case that the end user can choose to indicate?
Say that again. Is there any what that they can indicate?
End user, say for example, you know, can I indicate to OSP that every time I call, I would prefer to put that APN instead of the you know, real number?
Yeah, it all depends on the authority model, right? Like if they have the right to use that number as a presentation number, they probably have to get that vetted and a certificate created that would include that in, you know, most cases. But like I said, we have a couple different models here. But, you know, at least in the one we're intending to use in the quote unquote shaken model, I think it would have to get vetted and applied.
Okay, to the authority. Okay.
Yeah, it wouldn't be just a editable field or something like that, or you just program it into your phone or something like that.
I see. Okay, thanks.
Yep. I think
I do think we'll need some kind of text in the security considerations to say, you know, don't sign it if you don't, you know, have confidence in it belonging right to the something about the correspondence, right? Yep.
Yep.
Right, and that goes back to my question, Chris, you know, a few minutes earlier, that it should be clarified who is actually vetting the authorization to use this alternate number, making sure it is not something that the end user can program in their phone, like you said. So some text to clarify that, and that it should follow the same, whether it's a registration process, you know, like the registered caller solution, etc., to that effect, just to clarify so people don't get nervous.
Yep.
Thanks.
Which I don't think is inconsistent the rest of RCD information that we want to include here. But yes, I agree. We should make sure all those precautions are given and clear.
Okay.
John?
A while ago. I'm not sure I specifically recall.
I think we missed the beginning of what you said. Sorry.
Oh, I was saying I was in queue so long ago. I now I'm not sure I entirely remember what I was going to say. Oh, I think I was going to say yes, that this is like, additional identity and things like that in 3GPP plug into, like P preferred identity and things like that, right? So it's not that there aren't mechanisms that like enterprises or things like that couldn't use to suggest, I want to use this alternate presentation number for this call. And so I guess we're not going to stipulate like what the way is that happens here, but there are a number of at least somewhat standard ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe we could enumerate a few of those. Okay, good. Next page. Yeah, so there's we're having a little bit of a list discussion on and we can actually talk about that here if we want to. But like I said before, I submitted a whole bunch of fixes. I think we have a few things out of this meeting that we talked about fixing as well. But yeah, I tried to maybe give a summary of the bigger things. One was consistency of logic with the rules around constraints. So let's pause on that because maybe we want to discuss that. The URI recursion rules, I haven't had a chance to like really deeply read through that, but I took all the points from how it was confusing and there was a few logic errors there. So I'll make sure that's consistent and hopefully everybody understands the intent at least. And yes, Jack brought up updating the hashes. So I did go through the work to create those. But Ben, you want to comment?
The discussion on constraints and I assume verification rules. Is it the right time for that or is there another slide?
Nope, this is the last slide, so it's the time.
Are you done with the others? If anyone wants to talk about the others, then I can wait.
Now let's start talking about constraints.
Okay, and I'm glad to see Alec is right behind me in queue because I was going to maybe call on him. I assume some people have seen the emails, but they were right before this meeting, so maybe not. Right now, the clarified rules on verification, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with them, I'm kind of just poking at edge cases, says that that the verifier has to verify everything. We've got these interlocking now mechanisms between the signature itself, the JWT claim constraints, and the RCDI. And the use case that I think I've seen some people over on the IPN&I side of the world thinking about, and maybe Alec can pop in a minute and tell me if I'm on base or off base, is a use case where a caller has a authentication service that is signing with a delegate certificate and signs an RCD passport, and that passport has two purposes. One of them is to basically authenticate itself with a originating service provider, and then the other one is to push RCD claims all the way to the call endpoint, or at least somewhere downstream of the OSP. So that could be a TSP or it could be the handset. And in that particular use case, the OSP really just cares that the signature is good and that the number is in the TNAuth list. And my concern is if we put them in a position where they're having to verify the RCDI, including likely downloading a logo or an icon to verify that, because I mean, the whole reason RCDI is in there probably is because you've got external values in your RCD. If that puts an undue burden on the OSP, and of course Chris came back and pointed out rightfully that any idea that you validate some things and don't validate any other things can lead to madness. And maybe there's other ways that people should be thinking about doing this. And I'm okay if that's the answer. I'm just kind of trying to poke and be an irritant here.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you want to talk first, Alec, or do you want me to respond, or either way?
I think I'm on the same page as Ben. I think, but I would actually take it even a step further. I guess I would say I view RCDI verification as something that really should be done by the end device that's about to display it. If it fails, then everything else is fine, because the kind of use case we like, let's say you want to include 3 different logos, one for an iOS device, one for an Android. They're different sizes, so the OSP in Ben's example doesn't verify. They don't go fetch the resources. They'll verify that the RCDI claim matches the claim in the delegate cert, but they're not going to do any resource fetching. And then when it gets to the TSP does the exact same thing. The TSP just sends the URL as well as the integrity value for that URL to the device. And the device, when you go fetch something, you're responsible for checking the integrity. So I don't think it creates too much madness as far as verification. You're not verifying everything. You're verifying everything but RCDI, and only the resources that need to be displayed are fetched if you take that approach. That does mean you have to pass the RCDI to the end device, whatever is going to display it. But it saves you all these resources. I mean, you could have 5 URLs, and if you're only going to use one, or maybe even none, having to go fetch them. And it also gets to a point of, well, what if the server that's hosting that logo is down? If your passports fail verification because the server's down, well, I mean, it doesn't need to. You could just not display the logo, but you get the attestation elevation, you get all the things that are embedded in there. You just can't get a logo. So I don't think it creates too much madness to push that responsibility of verifying integrity down to the end device that's about to display that, whatever that is, it's going to check the integrity of.
Yeah, I think the way that, and people can push back on me if they want to, but I think the way that I like to think about this is Shaken, and this middle of the stream verification that OSPs does is a specifically Shaken thing. I tend to like to think of the IETF specs as sort of the pure implementation, and we talk about what happens at the authentication service and what happens at the verification service. I don't know what the thing that the OSP does. Is that a full verification service? Is that something else? But I think it would be a shame to sort of pollute the spec to try to accommodate that use case. And then, to me, it doesn't seem clean, and it doesn't seem like it'll be helpful to what we want to do in this specification. If we want to make something that talks about that more specifically somewhere else, or in a different IETF spec, or somewhere else, I think that's what I'd prefer to do. But I don't know. I'd like to hear people's feedback on that. I don't know if that's what you wanted to talk about, Jack, or if anyone else wants to respond to that.
Yeah.
I'll throw in real quickly that I resonated very strongly with the path that you just described, Chris. I would work hard to keep that division of description in place.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, I kind of just wanted to repeat what Alex said, and essentially as soon as we read the spec, we were like, well, the verification service can't do this because it's just going to take too long. And so we're immediately like, well, we're going to have to work out how to push this onto the end devices. And the whole like verify that everything looks correct, but don't verify the RCDI digests and just pass those on to the end devices is the obvious way of implementing it. But I don't think I disagree that the spec doesn't have to be explicit about that, because just divvying up the verification service between the service provider and the end user isn't far-fetched and seems like a reasonable division. But I kind of just want to say that it's not going to be a edge use case. I have a feeling it's going to be the only way it's implemented, unless someone implements a verification service but purely on the end user device.
Well, I still think the end device should, or something close to the end device should be verifying it again, but why don't we let, I think John's next.
Resonate with the strategy about let's do in the ITF, what is the ITF, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and leave other things for other places. I definitely am on board with that. I put some notes in the chat about this. I mean, I guess if we're talking about just validating the passport itself, not traversing any links or whatever, like, if there's a situation where we want the base, say, shaken passport to succeed, and if RCD doesn't validate for that not to fail, and this is one of the use cases I guess I've heard people discussing that they're concerned about this, like the solution to that to me seems pretty simple. If you don't want them to share a faith, put them in separate passports, right? Have an RCD passport that's like separate from the shaken passport, then the RCD passport can fail on its own. But I mean, I can certainly see a strategy where you're just like, look, if there's a passport with a mix of like shaken stuff and RCD stuff in it, and I just want to validate that that works, and like, not traverse any of the links lower down, but just does the JSON signature over that passport like validate, and use that as a basis for accepting origin dest, I wouldn't see any prohibition on that. And I rather like the idea of having like the RCDI stuff only fire off when it literally gets to the end device. That's I think the end state we all want for this, is for those links to actually be things that the end devices that are rendering to users would be able to access directly. I'm not sure I'm optimistic that we're going to get to that end state anytime soon. I think a lot of operators are going to want to do this, and then I'm sure there are 15 more Verstat additions that will be added to be asserted identity for all the links that are now pointing to the TSP's network and its cache of those values instead. But that caveat aside, that we'll see shenanigans like that. I mean, I think it certainly is reasonable to say that you're not going to fail the passport because you ignored those links, and you just don't care about what's in the cert for what the permitted values are for those things. So I can live with that if is that commensurate with what you're saying, Alec and Jack?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's yeah. I'm not saying we necessarily need to mention shaken or anything like that. It's just generically, I guess the integrity, I think, should be verified by the device that's about to display that URL, that resource that was whatever received from the URL. Because in any situation where you have a verification service that's doing more complex, verification of the passport and the certificate, the cryptography, all that stuff, and then passing a bunch of URLs down to the end device, and the URL is going to get selected by the end device. The entity doing the verification may not know what the end device is going to do. And so if you're putting that responsibility, verifying the integrity on that, then it has to verify all of them. Versus if it's the end device that does the integrity verification, then it knows what it's about to display. Maybe you have two URLs for two different images. One of them is a high res and one of them is a low res, and you try and get the high res and it doesn't work. It's not even integrity fails, but you just get a 404 error or server timeout, and then you try the low res and display it. I mean, there could be some logic in the end device. And I think having that device do the integrity verification and just pushing all integrity requirements down to that end stream device makes it clean. and is a good separation of responsibilities.
I generally don't disagree with the conversation here. I'll just ask one question. Do we think it would be a bad thing if the OSP verified the integrity in the images?
I don't think they will. It would just take too long.
I agree with that, but just maybe from a philosophical point of view.
So do you mean OSP or TSP, Chris?
OSP. Well, yeah, I hope we all agree that the TSP or the end device should always validate the integrity. But what I'm saying is, like, would it be a bad thing for an OSP to follow the rules that we've set, even though we don't think that they might? I don't know. Maybe that's just a exercise in the. Anyway.
I don't think it is a bad thing. I'm next in queue, so I'm going to jump in anyway. I think there's another use case which requires that, and that's the use case where an OSP validates the RCD passport and then turn around and writes those claims into a shaken passport before sending it downstream, which that means he's vouched for it, which means now he owns it, right? So he better have verified the integrity.
See, I guess I don't know that I agree with that. Why? I mean, the OSP. Why do they need to dereference the URL and make sure they match the integrity? If the OSP gets a delegate cert and it says, here's the RCD information that should be in there, here's the integrity values that you should get when you dereference it, and they verify the delegate cert, and that's all fine. They put it into the shaken passport in this specific to shaken example, and the image doesn't verify to the integrity. That doesn't really change anything because the end device won't display the image. So I think that's a critical advantage of not requiring the OSP to do it, or not requiring the TSP and just pushing it all to the end device. As an OSP software vendor, that could be very slow, and I think that will decrease the likelihood of people using that. So it'd be great if we didn't put the OSPs responsible for ensuring RCDI is matches the resource.
So I may have overstated that. I was meaning to argue in favor of it's okay for them to do it, and maybe I argued for they must do it, and I didn't really quite mean that. But yeah, I wanted to address a couple of other things that we've kind of back in the queue. When we talk about render into Caesar, my concern is the current text says you can't render to Caesars because we've got text in there that precludes not fate sharing all this, or at least in the proposed text. And there's ways we can write this that don't require any knowledge of shaken or any particular architectural assumptions. Where you can just say,
all right, go on. Sorry, Ben.
Where you can just say that a relying party must not rely on a integrity protected RCD claim without verifying the integrity. And I would argue that the relying party on that RCD is the party who's going to use the RCD, not the OSP in this case. And we all know there's, as much as we like the end device to be the one that renders all this and does the verification, we know good and well there's going to be TSPs that are going to eat that RCD passport and just shove the claims into their SEP header fields, kind of like kind of EC name style. We know that's going to happen, but we can write text that doesn't say it's the endpoint. We can just write text that says relying party.
Well, and that to me is why we should sort of stake our ground that if the OSP is going to do that, they better check the integrity, right? Like, I mean, anyway.
Right. Well, that's my point. Is I meant TSP, but my point is the relying party, the party that is going to either use that RCD claim data, or they're going to assert that it's true to someone else, has to verify the integrity hashes if it's there.
I don't know. I mean, how is the TSP going to send to the end device the image?
In the
URL.
They can send it in a call info
Yeah, but
Yeah,
they're not going to send the image. They're going to send the URL.
They
So I don't
could-
know.
They could,
like I said earlier, they'll make their own copy of it, right? Like, I mean, again, I agree with Ben. These guys, these TSPs are going to munge this 6 ways from Sunday, because you know why they're going to do it. They're going to do it for like data privacy reasons, because they don't want the endpoints to be hitting the origin servers.
but I think we're poking at the wrong layer here, at least from a standards perspective. I'm not suggesting that we need to say or even know anything about how these things get consumed. What we need to say is, if you're going to consume them, you better verify it. If you're not going to consume them, it's not your problem.
This is the rub, and it really comes down to what we mean by consume. And like, you know, a case where an OSP, for example, gets a delegate cert passport from the enterprise and is just doing enterprise attestation, pulls that RCD out and sticks it into a passport they're now vouching for, I would be surprised if they feel like they don't need to validate that, right? Because now they're the ones that are signing for it and vouching for it. I think it's a different, I mean, again, if we, you know, think about like liability, like I think it's like a different landscape when that passport that came from the enterprise is merely carried in addition to, this is like the fate sharing point, carried in addition to a shaken passport that is added by the OSP. In a case where the OSP actually compiles them, I think the OSP effectively can be interpreted as vouching for them. And these are the kinds of like subtle political things that are going to really change the calculus, which is why I like the relying party being defined in a way that any originating, terminating, or even like endpoint, if we ever get to that nirvana where like endpoint's the ones that actually see these passports, is the relying party. It's their obligation, whoever they are, to do this, right?
That's what I was trying to say. Or I don't know if you're agreeing with me or disagreeing with me.
I think the agreement, I'm in agreement.
You know, I think it makes it clear why we need it this way.
Right, exactly. Like, I think we already have what we want. I mean, maybe there's some more clarifying language we can put around it, but I think if we try to clarify it too much, we're going to create confusion. But maybe relying parties or something that represents that, and rather than trying to enumerate TSPs and OSPs and devices and all that other stuff, is the better approach.
But to clarify, one thing we're doing there, and I can also accept what John said earlier, that said if you don't want to fate share your passport information, then put them in separate passports. But what we're saying is that a passport can have more than one relying party, and they can have partially relying parties. You know, they're relying on part of the passport but not another passport. And I think that's okay, but the security guys might get hives over that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think that was sort of the point I was trying to make, that rather than trying to do half measures, we leave that either for another day or for people to do beyond the specifications or something like that. I discourage it, but maybe that's just my personal point of view.
I think an interesting thing here is that especially in the case of like the OSP copying the RCD information into like their shaken passport, which for separate reasons that we'll go into is I think a bit silly use case. But anyway, the OSP, a failed verification isn't an indictment on the OSP's like reliability or whatever, like that, like how much you should trust them. If the passport fails, you don't really, it's not really saying anything about like whether or not you should trust the person who created that passport more or less. And so there's a slight weird thing here where copying the RCDI across, if that RCD information gets changed or something like that, the RCDI will still verify it and it will cause the passport to fail verification. But like the OSP hasn't vouched for the contents of the RCD. They have vouched for the contents hashed by the RCDI. So as long as they're happy with the RCDI contents, like they've pre-verified it or something, they don't need to go and check that the RCD, that the things referenced in the RCD actually matches what's in the RCDI, because like the whole point of this scheme is so that you can change what's at the RCD, and it will just cause the passport to fail validation, or like the logo will fail validation or whatever. So in some ways, the OSP doesn't need to check that the RCD matches the RCDI, because as long as they trust, as long as they validated the RCDI information, the digest themselves, so they've pre-agreed them or whatever, then it's all fine, right? Because they're signing the RCDI. They're not signing whatever's hosted at that URL.
Mm-hmm. I don't think we disagree.
Yes.
But it's, you know, whether we want to explicitly document a mode that talks about that or not, I think is more the debate.
Yeah, I completely, I see the distinction, and I'm wondering. So, I mean, well, I guess to me, it doesn't make sense to have multiple people verifying the integrity, right, in the chain. Like, why? That's really, I guess, the way I'm viewing it. It doesn't make sense to have 3 different people verify that the contents of that server match the integrity. You only needed to do it once. And I guess the only thing I kind of view integrity failing as not a passport failing. And in a way, kind of a good way of putting an example is, what if it's not integrity fails, it's just the server times out. It doesn't respond. It takes too long. It's down. I don't know that means the passport failed. It really just means that one thing that you're trying to get is not available. I kind of treat integrity the same. In Shaken, in Addis 10,074, we wrote some language for the case of the verstat parameter, where we said you can only send TN validation past if you send the attestation downstream or it's attestation A, right? Like, that was the way we got around that kind of issue. I feel like maybe we could do the same thing here. If you get rid of integrity, if you don't send the integrity downstream, you need to verify it. If you send it downstream, then it's the downstream person's problem. So if the TSP chooses to dereference the URL and host it in their own web server, they need to verify integrity, clearly, because they're getting rid of the end integrity going to the end device. But if you choose not to do that, you pass integrity downstream, then it's not your responsibility. Maybe that's the way we approach this, of just saying you have to verify it as soon as you get rid of it.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, what I don't want to do is place constraints on who we expect relying parties to be in the architecture that could potentially be limiting downstream, right? Like, in terms of ways people want to use this. I'd rather have a universal rule that, works irrespectively, it's like an intermediary or something that for whatever reason is like munging RCD. And this doesn't even get into third-party RCD cases, by the way, which are a whole other like dimension of the story. But yeah, I mean, I guess my point is I still think there could be cases where the OSP, and I put some in the chat, like, might be interested in making sure that the links are validating properly, because once they're signing them in a passport, they're taking some responsibility for those links, even if they're not going to validate downstream, right? Like, I mean, it's that kind of just policy level stuff that makes me think we may end up, unfortunately, and I agree, it's the end state we want is one where nobody cares until we get to the device that's actually going to render this. That's the end state we all want for RCD. Nobody needs to validate it under that, other than that device. I just fear there are a whole bunch of cases where other people are going to want to validate it. It'll be redundant validations. It's a waste of time for all the reasons, all the technical reasons, but for policy reasons, it's not a waste of time.
So I think that we can cut through all this by just defining that the relying party for the RCDI hash is whoever needs it. If I can see from what Alec was saying, if you have an OSP that copies the claims to their Shaken passport, but they also copy the RCDI and send it downstream, then they weren't really the relying party for RCDI. It's whoever further downstream does it. If, on the other hand, they feel the need for some reason or another, some policy or something to do it, that's fine. They can do it too. It doesn't hurt anything. Whether it's a good idea is not our problem. So, but I think the conclusion I think we're coming to is that the RCDI has its own relying party, which may or may not be the same relying party as the rest of the certificate, as the signature and the JWT claim constraints would have.
I think when we talk integrity, we think a lot mostly about images, but I wonder, what if it's a JCL? Does that change anything?
I think it makes the problem even more important that we don't require to verify it, in the sense that it could require 2 round trips. You could have to go get the J card and then go get the URL sequentially. And so that's why I'm really hesitant about the expectation that the OSP or the TSP do it if they're passing the integrity downstream. Gets even worse when you talk about kind of having both.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I would like to call attention back to what our chain of trust is and where trust is rooted in what these attestations even mean. And a lot of what's being claimed in a passport is based on trust that there is a relationship between the signer and the entity that the signing is taking place for, right? That the signer knows and has proved that that entity is the correct person to make the claims that are in that passport. When there are claims that contain URIs, the trust model to those URIs are very different. What we've engineered is the ability to verify that the person that we are signing for has handed us a integrity check, that the integrity check checks out, and that's it. When we skip that integrity check, we just need to be very clear that all we're talking about is that the trust back to the end user was entirely in what that integrity check was made. There's a whole suite of potential attacks that we should at some point perhaps investigate for what happens when the web server that is maybe not entirely under either the signing parties or the end user's control decides to serve a completely different thing. And we've got a pretty good, I think we've done a pretty good job of capturing in the documentation that all we've done is say that the attestation is that at the time the signature was made, the stuff that was in there had the bits. If nobody's checking that, we need to be very clear that I'm about to say that the checking hasn't happened, but I really don't want to step in that specifically just yet. We want to be very clear what the trust model around the veracity of that eventual source data is. I apologize for the ramble, but I think that keeping those separate is going to be helpful.
Yeah, and I think I totally, that's exactly where I started from. I think maybe there's room for, like, if we use the words relying party, we can sort of change it around so that, you know, I agree with the premise that, you know, if you're not going to display an image or something like that, then that has nothing to do with, like, the telephone number. Maybe there's some room for that. So maybe we can sort of craft it in a way that we're not making the logic complex, but we're maintaining the security around and the integrity for those that need to use the integrity. But I forget who was next. Russ, were you next?
Well, I'm going to respond to Robert in part, so I should probably go next.
Go for it.
We put the hash of the thing you're fetching into the claim to make sure that even if it was a web server that you're not the administrator for, and that administrator swapped the image, that would fail because the hash wouldn't match. So we tried to eliminate one aspect of what Robert was talking about, but whether the image is appropriate or not still falls to a policy question.
Right. That's at the creation of the image and the integrity, right? The end user has to.
At the time the passport signed is where
right.
that matters.
When you verify it, you sort of trust that that has been done, and you put the trust in the signer of the information.
I think we have to be very careful with the integrity. You know, not to say that the OSP isn't allowed to, but it's kind of meaningless if the OSP verifies it, or the TSP for that matter, if they're not changing the URL. If, you know, I get let's say I'm acting as an OSP and I get a delegate cert and it's got a link in it, whether it's an image or a JCard, and I go fetch it and it matches the integrity, and then I send it downstream, and then downstream goes and fetches it, it may not match anymore. An attacker could change the contents. The first request I'll return, the data that I'm supposed to. The next request I won't. And so I think really integrity is only valuable if you do it and then use the URL or use the contents. If you are then passing the URL, it's kind of meaningless. You kind of have to do it at that last point. It's not to say OSP can't check it, but just because the OSP did doesn't help you downstream. You still have to check it.
Yeah, I think meaningless is a little strong, although I understand your point. I mean, like if somebody's actively just sending unverified images because they were given an integrity value for a different image than they're actually sending, there could be some value in the OSP doing it, but I'm not advocating that that's like the only thing we need to do. Like ultimately, hopefully that gets caught at the point where it's actually going to be displayed or sent to a handset or wherever we're talking about.
Maybe meaningless was too strong, but I guess kind of getting back to the liability, maybe it's kind of important to recognize that the OSP is not liable. Because they unless you're expecting them to dereference the URL and then create a new one, that can happen. So I think we kind of have to be careful and not, the OSP, let's say we get, as an OSP, we get some image, we verify it, we say, okay, we like this image, it's not some inappropriate image, it's reasonable, we check we have its integrity. When we get that claim, here's the URL and here's the integrity, we are okay with this integrity, it could change. So I think we kind of just, really the OSP is responsible for the integrity. They're not responsible for the contents of the server. I think if you look at it that way, that solves the problem in a way that
But I
works.
think this goes back to maybe the original point of like, maybe that's a best practice that, we determine, we're saying today it doesn't matter if the OSP does it, but maybe like for whatever reason, it'd be better if the OSP solved that because we're getting a lot of people sending false images or something. I don't know. I'm just making something up, but I think the point is that like from a protocol spec point of view, those are more best practices. I don't know if that's the right word, but that those types of things that I think are appropriate for IP and NI specs and more usage specs rather than the core protocol, where I think we just can focus on the authentication service and verification service, and then where those things are performed and what level they're performed. But I think where I'm agreeing is like maybe we can have some relying party words in the verification service that stretches it a little more to allow, so that it, from a spec point of view, it's okay, but we still have, the strictness to say that you should really be checking the integrity or I don't know, something like that.
We've talked quite a bit about this, and I think we're in danger now of start talking about what people should do and best practices, and
Right.
we'd be best off if we just maybe get some text about what we think we agree on and then see.
Sure.
And so I'm propose that we close the queue for this point after Jack, who was already in queue. I only raised my hand so I could make a marker in the queue.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like I've been on the queue for quite a while now. So I think I would possibly go further than what's been said so far, in that the RCDI failing, the digests failing to match should not be considered a verification failure, because there are situations, for example, div, where the person who's diverting it, the server could have gone down while they're diverting it and come back up afterwards. Them failing the call, sorry, not them failing the call, but them failing that verification and throwing some error is a bad thing to happen at that point. And even just in a straight line case, the TSP verifying it, if they're not going to rehost the images or something like that, then they can't reasonably, if they validate the digests, they are doing it, they're doing more harm than good, because there are so many situations where maybe one of the logos has gone down but the other one's still working. If they verify that, they have prevented some rich call data reaching the end user where everything that the end user wanted was fine. So I would go so far as to say that the digests not matching what is at the URL should not be considered a verification failure, and only the person that is extracting the information out of that URI should be doing anything with that digest. And even if that fails, all they have to do is just discard that single logo or that single whatever it is. They can just discard that and everything is still fine. They can even carry on with the NAM, because the NAM has been signed for.
Mm-hmm. I don't know, the case where there's an operational issue, that the server's down, I don't know if it's good to define the protocol based on those things. I mean, maybe it's worthy of consideration, but and I don't know if that was your only point, Jack, but I tend to think, those are, if a server is down, then unfortunately things will fail, is a general rule for everything.
What I'm saying is that the server going down for part of the information does not invalidate the rest of the information. Mm-hmm. If you lose one logo, you still have the name, and so the RCD passport should not fail verification, because it's still correct. It's just you shouldn't use some of the information that it references.
John?
Agenda bash, we keep talking about this. This is a working group item. This is late. Let's skip connected identity and just do this. I've got a hard stop at 5, but let's just keep going. Is that okay, chairs?
Do you think we're going to accomplish anything, or are we going around in circles? There's no point in continuing to go around in circles.
I think it's better to do this than talk about a non-working group item and a potential charter change. I don't know. Is it circles? I don't think this is circular. I think we're actually getting a lot of agreement. I mean, I think this fundamental question of what actually counts as passport validation is important. And like, if, you know, how we scope passport validation and understand it is super important. And I think we can resolve that. I mean, I think, for example, we all pretty much agree that, like, you know, if the JSON object's signature validates against the cert, there's, you know, and there's a level of passport validation in that. I know when Chris and I were corresponding about this in the last couple of weeks, you know, one of the examples I posed to him when I was arguing, you know, for JWT constraints being honored in these cases was like, we wouldn't do this for like level of attestation, right? There's like a restriction that level of attestation, you know, you can only sign like B and C or your primitive values and someone signs an A. Like, even though the entire passport validates, I argued you shouldn't trust the origin test if that's true. Do people roughly agree with that?
Sorry, do you mind just repeating?
Sorry. So imagine that there's a passport, and, you know, it has a JWT constraint in the cert that's signing for it, right? And let's not say it's a delegate cert. Let's just take a hypothetical case where there's some gateway operator who is only allowed to sign Bs and Cs. And let's say that operator generates a shaken passport, and like that shaken passport has an LOA, a level of attestation of A in it. Like, when that shows up at a verification service and, you know, terminating service provider, like, should that entity still trust the origin dest if the LOA is an invalid value for JWT constraints? What do people think about that?
My tendency there is to think that the validating the constraints is part of validating the passport. I mean, it's part of validating the signature. So even though I have a signature that's there, if it's violating what's in the certificate, then you should not trust that. You should not use that signature. So I think I'm with you on that point.
This is different. I'm trying to tease out why this is different. And I'm not convinced that it isn't different. But it's like, so Alec and Jack convinced me it's not different.
I think it really just comes down to the fact that this verification has to be performed at the end entity device, the device that's going to consume that URL, right? It has to be. Now, it could be consumed, could happen earlier, but it has to be consumed there. Otherwise, it's just too easy for someone to have a timing attack where, you know, you request it, I give you the right URL, and then the device goes to request it, and I give it a different URL. So you have to do it at the end. You could do it earlier, but given that that's the way, you know, the integrity works, I think it just makes sense to separate integrity verification from the verification service, right? What you're verifying in the verification service is the integrity is a value you expect. The integrity in the passport matches the integrity in the delegate cert if you're doing that kind of model, but not that the resource has the value that matches the integrity value, because that check is really intended to be done by the device. I mean, this is so similar to sub-resource integrity in a web browser. You know, a web browser may embed an HTML page from another website, but it's not going to check the integrity of that iframe that it's embedding. It's just going to pass that on to the client, because if it did and it worked, that doesn't mean the client couldn't do the verification. It has to be done in the client. I mean, I guess that's just the way I view it.
I mean, you know, again, because I imagine the TSP is actually going to consume that in addition to just verifying it, right? I mean, I totally agree with you, and I've said this a million times so far. I want those URLs to reach the end user device and for them to access them. I doubt that will be the practical case. And in fact, the Security Association is going to terminate whether we logically consider it the VS or if it's, you know, some modular component that's like one step off from the VS after the VS has done its job. I don't want to argue architecturally about how we want to draw those boxes, but the Security Association is likely going to terminate at the terminating service provider. Or do you disagree with that?
I don't disagree with that. And I would say if they do that, then they would be responsible for verifying the integrity. If you choose to do that, then go ahead, do it. And you need to verify the integrity, put it in your own web server, and then send that URL down. If that's what you're going to do, you need to verify the integrity. I'm just saying that may not be the model for everybody. And if that isn't the model that a given entity is using, then they shouldn't be verifying it. It should be the downstream entity verifying it. Whoever's consuming that URL and displaying it or putting it in their own web server, the last person to consume that URL to dereference it is the one who needs to verify it. Whoever it is, doesn't matter.
Who needs to. Other people optionally might, but the person who needs to is that person.
And they optionally might, but if they choose to, that shouldn't mean that we're assuming they're responsible, because we know it could have been changed. So we kind of need to take that caveat. You can, but it doesn't mean you're liable for it. And it also, I mean, I'm concerned it's inefficient. So I hope people don't, and I hope we don't act like it improves the security, because it really doesn't, to have them do it.
Yeah.
From a pure security perspective, in terms of the relying party will do precisely the same redundant operations. I agree with that.
And I think even further than that, like someone who's not the end user of this, like what can they do with the information that it doesn't match? Like if the originating service provider or some TSP who's handing this entire shaken passport onto the end user, if they download this logo and go, oh, it doesn't match the digest, what do they do? Like there's nothing they can do at that point to change anything. Like the rest of the RCD information is still there and is still valid. They can't edit the RCD because it's signed. So their only option is just to hand it on down and just go, oh, that's gonna be wrong when the end user sees it. Like,
of course not, they could fail it.
Yes, but if they do, then you've lost the RCD of the rest of the RCD information. Like you've lost the name. You've got.
My thinking was similar to what you were saying, John. Although I don't know if this is a great excuse, but like, where do we expect this to really fail? Like even with shaken passports, like it's going to be some somebody used the wrong cert or wrong information, and the originator of that signature probably wants to know about it more from an operational point of view, an operational failure point of view, than they're actually trying to get away with sending the wrong logo or something like that. So I think that's similar to what you're saying, John. Like you're just fundamentally doing the wrong thing, and you should know about it so that you fix it sooner rather than later. And is the OSP a good place to do that, since the OSP is probably, providing a service to the person that signed the passport originally. So I'm not saying that's an argument to be hard-nosed about this, but it's one argument.
Fail a passport that won't validate. If you're any intermediary that sees a passport and you believe it won't validate as you're looking at it, regardless of any shenanigans might happen like after you forward it on, right? Like, I mean, any attestation elevation case that is not considering RCD, if you don't think what you're getting from the enterprise is valid, you're going to fail the call, right? And I think a lot of this, and this is the subtlety I was raising about like attestation level constraints and JWT constraints, is just the question of, if some part of it, if some constraint that is not just orig and dest, the things that base passports are intended to communicate, if that you think is, you have no reason to think that stuff is illegitimate, but if something else in the passport is broken, should you fail the whole passport, wherever you are that you're checking it in the call path? And this was what I was trying to convince Chris of. As far as I can tell, I think usually, yeah, you should. Now, the only thing that's a wrinkle to that RCD introduces is this question of dereferencing further links, right, that like you might not want to do along the way. And that I could see getting kicked down to whoever the relying party is ultimately, whether it's TSP network at the endpoint or something. If all you're doing is your check is just saying, okay, like this JCL field checks out, or like whatever, something like that, and I'm not going to do any of the recursive like URL generation within it. Like that's a can I can easily imagine people just lazily kicking. But I mean, if somebody checks it and goes to the trouble to ascertain that there is something broken in it, I mean, is it their obligation to continue to pass the call? And I know this is in part a legal, like safe harbor question of who gets to block and why. But from a security perspective, if the passport, you know, contains fundamental flaws that you believe shouldn't allow to being, you should not allow it to be validated down the road, I mean, I think nip it in the bud, right?
Yeah.
I think what I'm saying is, though, that you just shouldn't consider that a failed validation. I think RCD is fundamentally different in that some parts of it can go wrong, but you still want to keep the rest of it. And
well, I think it is a failed validation, but maybe can we go the other way? Then, like, it failed, but okay to pass along. I don't know, because I think not saying that it hasn't passed integrity still goes to the fundamental point of, like, you know, that passport is not valid.
But I'm saying it is valid. John, I mean, just to let you know, there's quite a long delay between you unmuting and us being able to hear you.
Shouldn't unmute.
Yeah, I'm trying to mute and unmute and be responsible. I'm just saying, like, if the passport doesn't validate, it's not valid. I mean, again, I have a really hard time. This is why I raised that LOA example. I have a really hard time thinking of a defensible security argument that if the passport doesn't validate against JWT constraints or something like that, that it's valid. That this passport's only partially valid. I'm going to trust the origin of the DAST even though the IAT is broken. Like, we have no language in A224 or anywhere else that I think hints that is possible, right?
I agree with you. I think for everything other than RCDI, I completely agree with you. I think RCD is special.
Oh, do you mean RCDI? Or do you mean RCD URLs don't match RCDI? I think that's an important distinction. I'm not saying if RCDI in the passport doesn't match delegate cert RCDI claim constraint, that's valid. That's totally invalid. Kill it. It's I don't want to dereference the URLs to see if the contents of the URLs match. And I know we're we don't want to talk about in the unlikely event of a server failure, but I guess I'm looking at it. I think it's highly likely, and it's not a failure. It's too slow for my verification service. I'm not going to wait for 3 seconds to dereference this URL where the end device might be willing to.
Well, maybe
I guess that's what I'm concerned about. It's not a failure. It's just it's too slow. I mean, we see this with certificates, which you'd think would be faster than RCD stuff.
I wonder if there's a way we can get our cake and eat it too, like that we say. I mean, I think the point is that if the signature over the JSON object is valid, then you can pretty much trust that information, but we just don't want to go to the next step. Maybe there's some way we can creatively word it where I'd rather, like, that's why I was trying to say, like, can we go the other way? Like, you know, we don't want to say that if the integrity is broken, that it's still valid. I don't think that's something we should say at all, just fundamentally. But can we say, like, in a creative way, you know, like, if you're only interested in partial information and XYZ criteria, like the signature, I guess, maybe not XYZ, the signature is okay. Can we call it something different or something like that?
I mean, I can imagine some creative wording that along those lines. So it can't ever be the signature's broken. It can't ever be that the constraint was checked and didn't work. I can imagine some language that suggests that, like, not everybody is going to dereference those URIs and be capable of looking at the potential permitted values for them. And that as a consequence of that, you know, those entities are not doing full validation of RCD. It would be something like that. and that we create like two categories of validation. There's a validation that's specific to RCD. This is trying to speak to Jack's, where I think Jack is going anyway. That there's kind of two categories of validation of RCD. One where you actually are dereferencing the sub-URIs for it, and another way where you're not. And that when you're doing the first category, like you validate the JSON works, the constraints, as far as you know, there's no violation of a constraint that you can see without looking at those URLs. Then there's a second category of validation, and anyone actually relying on any of those URLs or related stuff that is, embedded in those sub-URL references, like you can't rely on it unless you do the second category of validation. And like, that's something that we're effectively expecting the ultimate relying party, be that the end user device or, the terminating service provider's verification service that sucks up that and rehosts it or whatever does it. I mean, Jack, is that kind of what you're asking for?
I would like to jump in because I've been at the front of the queue for a while.
I'm sorry, Ben. I don't have the queue up. I have the chat up.
I know. I'm the one supposed to be watching the queue, but I was going to suggest something like what you're saying, and I was going to take it further and completely decouple passport verification from RCDI verification. So we've got a passport verification that just says everything in the passport that's covered by the signature is covered by the signature. But then we have this RCDI thing, and of course we signed it, so it was covered by the signature, and it is providing this mechanism to the relying party of the dereferenced material that they need to do as an additional verification over and above the certificate validation. So a valid certificate, right now, a valid certificate does not imply anything at all about the integrity of external material. A failure of RCDI does not in any way impact the validity of the certificate.
That's what I've been going for.
Failure of RCDI does not in any way impact the validation of the passport, you mean, not the failure of the certificate?
The passport, yes, the passport.
Phrasing it that way, it does not pass my sniff test. Precisely because it's saying like I can validate this, and if it's broken, it's okay. I can use the rest of the passport. That's the thing I don't want to say. That's the thing that makes me worry.
One of the things that Jack has mentioned, I think that we might have to consider there is the idea of a temporary brokenness versus some kind of permanent brokenness. If it was broken just because the server was slow versus it was broken because the data came back wrong.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I haven't meant to ignore Alex's argument either about just the server's like slow or unresponsive or whatever. I mean, I think those are all valid points. I guess I'm looking at this much. What I want to do is be able to define two processes, one of which passport validates if you don't ever see anything is broken in it because you're not even messing with that RCDI stuff, right? Like if anything we write that's to me like I check this and actually this doesn't validate, but I'm still going to pretend it's valid. That language of that form makes me extremely uncomfortable. And Russ, would you speculate that might make people in the security area relatively uncomfortable? But like language, it's like, look, there's one set of checks you do when you don't care about that RCDI stuff, right? And then there's another deeper set of checks you do when you do. And like as somebody who is consuming this passport and validating it, you could either do one or the other. And like, is that sellable, do you think? Is that close enough, Jack, to what you're asking for? And Alec?
I think there's an interesting way to spin what you've just said, which is, how about if you fetch that information, it must match the check. And then Alex can just not fetch it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly what I was going to suggest. Yeah. It basically decouple, right? So you've got passport verification, which does not mention dereferencing the URLs. Has nothing to do, you don't need to dereference the URLs. You're verifying the RCDI matches the delegate cert and all this other stuff, but you're not dereferencing URLs. And then you've got, okay, now it's time to dereference the URLs. You need to go dereference it, and then you need to verify that it matches the provided integrity. And they're independent processes. And you may have an entity that does both, You may have an entity that does just one. They really have nothing to do with each other. I think that's the way we cover this.
So before I give up my hands up, I agree with what Alec just said, but I wanted to make another point too, is that the things Alec said about needing to pass the hash forward if you pass the URL forward needs to go in the security considerations of this document, because basically if you just because I verified it now doesn't mean it's going to be verified 500 milliseconds from now. And if for any reason you can't send that hash forward, or your end user can't use that hash, then you need to provide some other integrity mechanism to make sure no one messes with you. And that could be something like copying it onto your own,
even though
your own managed website.
Even though we suspect people will do that strongly, at least you and I do, Ben, I'm not sure we want to tell them how to do it, or offer that as like a standard practice. Again, we all want to get to the state where that isn't how this works. So I'd probably rather put some guidance that dances around that and puts the right musts and must nots that would constrain that without explicitly describing that as a practice in an RC we're going to publish.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah, maybe something about the fact that you can't separate the integrity and the RCD when delivering it. So that
exactly, the property.
So that relying parties have the opportunity to do the integrity check.
I think the question that is still unanswered is whether, when describing whether or not an RCD passport is valid, whether that includes the fact that the digest matches what's at the URLs. Because from my point of view, including that in the definition of whether an RCD passport is valid causes quite a few problems, because networks are complicated and like files and stuff can just mess up everything so that it might be invalid for one person and valid for another. So if you completely decouple the fact that the RCDI matches the URLs from whether or not the RCD passport is valid, I feel like you're much more likely to get a much more reliable system. And yeah.
But I think we're acknowledging that you can separate it. I just think it's a matter of semantics of whether or not you call it, fully validated. Because at the end of the day, the creator of the RCD wanted to include that image, right? So it should be receivable and renderable, even though maybe some devices can't render images or whatever else. But it is the intended. I mean, I think what the sender sends, and the reason that they included integrity with an image is because that was the intent. We should honor that somehow. Except for cases where either the device can't render images or those types of situations.
So we're getting very close to the time that we have allocated, and John indicated he had a hard stop. I think that we did get some traction, and that it's the kind of traction that's going to require people to go off and think about it and start to propose some text. I think we're going to need another interim before we get to 112 to come back and continue this conversation. So, sorry, John. If you think I'm wrong.
Plus, there's the connected identity thing we didn't even get to.
That's true.
For me, some of you may have heard about this, yes.
Yeah, so I think I would like to target something maybe second week of October.
Yep. Yeah, I think that would be good.
And let's not wait. I think we have enough inertia in this conversation that there's a good chance that we can keep the ball rolling in email. I think we understand enough of where everybody is coming from that the impedance that email brings won't
Right.
get too much in the way.
And I have to go through that text about the other topics anyway, so I'll try to put something out sooner rather than later.
I was just about to ask, is this the only real open issue, or are there still others?
Well, I think the other issues depend on me providing clear text also anyway, so
Okay.
I think the other ones are more well understood, hopefully. If there is still discussion to be had, it's better to do it on new text anyways.
We've got 5 minutes, and I don't want to throw those 5 minutes away. Is there anything that we want to try to sum up? Does somebody want to take a shot at where we are, or do you think that we've pretty much already captured it as best we can in the notes, what we've got?
I'd like to apologize for the note towards the end of it. It's quite hard to type.
Jack, what you've done is quite useful. I really appreciate the effort that you put into it.
Yeah, I was about to say, don't apologize. I think we're sorting out something that's important here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had one thing I wanted to mention just as an intro. Chris, I think I need to follow up with you on this. I think maybe it might be worth mentioning or recommending vectorized images. I think we've kind of been looking at with vendors and things is kind of what these images display are going to look like, and kind of it's having a recommended square image that's vectorized means you can put a round mask on it, square with rounded corners mask on it. You can resize it. I think otherwise these are just going to get messy when you actually go to implement them. So not to discuss here, but maybe it's worth recommending because.
Well, I think actually the good thing is that's more in the SIP core draft, which we need to follow up on also. So I think I do have some image text in there to try to do that, but make sure you join the SIP core list also, Alex, so we can talk about that issue. Because I think that's, hopefully easier to extend. And we'll probably want to talk about whether it's optional or, okay. I haven't had a lot of discussion around that actually, to be honest. So I think that's a good topic to discuss.
I put my hand up to say I'm a little bit nervous about that being defined at the IETF layer level, or at least in the general basics of how RCD works, because I can imagine RCD getting reused in some other context that has very different display limitations. So it almost seems to me like something that, I don't know if it's IPNI or that some other group should be looking at, maybe 3GPP.
Well, I assume Alec means like SVG or something like that, which is pretty standardly supported, at least on like, mobile phones and things like that. But I get your point, Ben, also.
That is what I meant, SVG.
Yeah. I think it would be pretty okay to just put SVG in there if everybody agrees. But we can have that discussion, obviously.
Okay, we've got like 1 minute. Is there any last point anyone wants to make?
Well, it was a great discussion anyway. Thanks everyone for the discussion. And thanks, John, for giving up the time.
All right.
My pleasure. As I said, kind of a weird day, as some of you may have heard.
With all that.
All right. Thank you all.
Take care.